Sorry I skipped a month. The world ended and sort of threw me off. I hope you understand, and I also hope you're washing your hands and staying home as much as humanly possible. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to talk about every album I've listened to in the past 2 months. I'm just going to stick to the stuff for which I really have something to say. So that's most of the major records you would probably expect me to have a take on at this point, and some personal favorites that maybe flew under your radar. There's definitely some albums I really liked in the past 2 months, but don't really have a whole lot other to say than, yeah, this is good. So as always, you can find everything new I've listened to so far this year on my 2020 listening log over on rateyourmusic.com. For some reason, I have a lot to say about Lil Uzi Vert's Eternal ATAKE. Long story short, you'll forgive me for not believing that this album managed to live up to the hype even remotely. This was just in one ear and out the other for me. Hardly anything in the way of any standout moments. Long story long, what makes it even worse for me is that he took 3 years off, pretended to quit music, pulled a bunch of other weird hijinks to generate hype for this thing, and it sounds like he could have recorded it the week after he dropped Love is Rage 2. Hardly any progression or evolution in his abilities as a performer or the sort of production he favors seems to have taken place in the time off. He seems to want this to be some sort of 3-act concept album about him exploring space in a rocket ship or something, but there's hardly any lines about space or rocket ships outside of a couple small skits that happen at the end of some of these tracks, mostly toward the front half, so he doesn't even really follow through with it the entire way through the album. It's also brought down pretty significantly by the lack of features. Getting close to an hour of just Uzi gets pretty stale, and 30 seconds of Sid toward the end of the record isn't really enough to make up for it. Also, what was he thinking putting the track with a feature from a lesbian back to back with the track where he boasts about how he can make a gay girl turn to a straight? I honestly think LUV vs. the World 2 is a substantial improvement over Eternal ATAKE, but considering how he wants us to treat it as the second disc of Eternal ATAKE, I think it just serves to weigh the whole experience even further down. No way am I interested enough in what Uzi's doing here to want to subject myself to it when I could spend that hour and 44 minutes that this deluxe edition lasts listening to R.A.P. Ferreira's Purple Moonlight pages twice and get far more enjoyment out of the experience. I don't mean to come off as some sort of backpacker elitist with that segue, but I mean, come on, this album's great. The instrumentals feel so alive, with plenty of nods to spiritual jazz legends including Sun Ra and Pharoah Sanders, and the artist formerly known as Milo is in peak form, performing a balancing act with equal amounts of wit, charisma, and highly abstract musings, which seem to have gotten more and more delicately constructed and thought out as the years have gone on. This newest alias of Rory Ferreira's seems to be allowing him to open up in some very interesting directions, and I'm looking forward to seeing what that means for future projects under this moniker. I hope he keeps the Jefferson Park Boys around. So, imagine being Jay Electronica, releasing your debut album after such a long wait, only for, of all people in 2020, Jay-Z to wrap circles around you on pretty much every track on that debut album. And that's pretty much what happens here on A Written Testimony. It's not even that Jay-Z necessarily puts down some of his, career best verses here or anything. It's just that J.E. sounds like he'd rather be anywhere than in the booth doing the thing that any kid with a cracked copy of FL Studio and a blue snowball could do and just put out a proper full-length project. It sounds like he's barely even a presence on his own album. The only times he really manages to grab my attention are for the wrong reasons, namely the vague anti-Semitism. If I'd waited for this project for 13 years like many Jay Electronica fans did, I'd frankly be insulted by the final product. As it stands though, as someone who only really became aware of the whole Jay Electronica album situation a couple years ago, and isn't really invested in him as an artist one way or another, I'm just kind of underwhelmed. It's hard for me to not be envious of London saxophonist Shabaka Hutchings. He's got 3 bands all signed to Impulse, one of the most important labels in the history of black music, and all 3 of them have put out fantastic albums for that label in 3 consecutive years. First in 2018, his double drummer, chordal instrument lacking quartet Sons of Kemet dropped Your Queen is a Reptile. Last year, his futuristic, psychedelic, synth-heavy trio The Comet is Coming released Trust in the Life Force of the Deep Mystery, and this year he's kept the streak going with the Impulse debut of Shabaka and the Ancestors, We Are Sent Here by History. This is a far more direct and traditional kind of band band than either of his others, but the music they make is no less enjoyable for it. It's a collaboration between Hutchings and musicians from around Johannesburg, South Africa, so as you might reasonably expect, they play a flavor of jazz pretty heavily influenced by Afrobeat and other styles of music from the African continent. And as with any Shabaka Hutchings outing, there is a deep political message embedded within the music as well, informed by that same African tradition through poetry written and delivered by Siyabonga Matembu in English, Zulu, and Xhosa. Xhosa? Not a native speaker of that language, if you could believe it. There's a lot of fairly dark stuff here about the coming end of the human race and the things we might wish to preserve or discard about our legacy as that extinction looms closer and closer. These morbid themes are paired with some passionate playing from the ancestors. Especially enjoyable for me is the interplay between the front line of Hutchings on tenor sax and Mutsunzi Mvubu on alto sax. They work off of each other in some really creative ways. Apologies to anybody whose names I probably said a little less than perfectly. Great album. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard wish they could integrate microtonality into their music as seamlessly as Horse Lords do. The Common Task is probably the most patience-testing album I've listened to in a while, and that's coming from a die-hard fan of Swans and the early music of Philip Glass. When it's done right, I'm a big fan of hearing a single idea unfold over a long period of time, and Horse Lords hit the nail right on the head. Between the polyrhythms, the notes between the cracks of the Western 12-tone system, and the bagpipes, there's really something for everybody here. From the track list of this new Thundercat album, I was really hoping for another godlike Zach Fox verse to bless us like rays of light beaming down from heaven. Instead, he just cameos as the pilot of a commercial flight for one of the interlude tracks. The rest of it is what it is good, and in places even really great, so I guess I can forgive Zach being completely underutilized. It's fine. I'm fine. It's fine. Childish Gambino's newest album has a couple of really great tracks, and by that I mean literally a couple. 2. The rest is either decent, not really interesting enough to grab my attention, or in the case of track 7, just straight up embarrassing. This is only an hour long and it felt like 2. It's kind of a shame. I was really on board with Childish Gambino finally after the release of This Is America and Awaken My Love. Maybe this is just Donald Glover emptying the skeletons out of his closet in preparation for something more fully realized, but I won't hold my breath. Now this is where it's really at for me. In the hands of most other artists, Heaven to a Tortured Mind, the new Yves Tumor album, would probably be a pretty standard, catchy, well-composed pop and rock album, and that would probably be fine enough for me on its own. But with Sean Bowie at the helm, a guy who's made some pretty bold and experimental music in the past few years, this album is elevated to a level that really feels like a new direction for rock music, with production and sampling techniques lifted from hip-hop and Yves Tumor's previous work in more of a sound collage vein. The sound design is just next level, and as I already mentioned, the songwriting is there too, which keeps this from just being a collection of cool sounds with not so much going on under the hood. It really keeps me coming back to try and find new details hidden within these songs, and I don't think it would really have that pull for me if the songs weren't so memorable. And now, time to let go of all my credibility in the eyes of indie fans. I was not all that impressed by the new album from The Strokes. I can't help but feel like a large part of the warm reception the new Abnormal has received from most fans and critics is largely due to the fact that, admittedly, this is a better album than Come Down Machine. But it's really not hard to be better than Come Down Machine. Even First Impressions of Earth, an album that's basically half filler, is gonna look like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in comparison to Come Down Machine. I just really don't like Come Down Machine. I don't really see what makes the new Abnormal sound like the grand return to form for the Strokes I've been seeing so many people hail it as. I mean, the band gives some pretty good performances, and the production is crisp and clear, and it really lets you hear every instrumental element of all these songs pretty well. I generally like the borrowings from new wave and synth pop when they're integrated well, although I think they hit their mark better on Angles, which is still the most underrated Strokes album. But there's something on a more fundamental level with this album that just bugs me. For me, the Strokes are at their best when they're at their most direct and to the point, with a couple of small added details for good measure to keep things interesting. Like, maybe you have a pedal point in your middle 8 section, or some cool counterpoint between the melodic line and the guitar riff. I'll even let you have bongos if you can back it up with a good tune that doesn't waste a whole lot of time. Unfortunately, many of the songs on the new Abnormal feel unnecessarily stretched out. Like, I think most of these songs would actually work pretty well for me if they were around, say, 3 or 4 minutes, but as it stands, they're often closer to 5 or even longer. and I don't really think they justify that length that well. I don't consider it a coincidence that my least favorite Strokes albums approach or exceed a duration of 40 minutes. Also, on a more analytical note, Jesus Christ, these guys need to get back to using some less standard chord progressions. How many more times am I going to have to hear variations on 2, 5, 1, 4, 6, 2, 5, 1, or 2, 5, 3, 6, loop ad nauseum in pop and rock songs? It's just so fucking stale at this point. So anyway, don't get me wrong, I think the new Abnormal definitely has its moments, but generally I just don't think the Strokes have a whole lot left to say. Code Orange's latest album, Underneath, sort of feels like the dark, industrial, metalcore answer to the last Liturgy album, where HAQQ used electronic glitch effects like short loops and stutters to create a kinetic forward momentum and generally inspire awe within the context of this hyper-bright, transcendental experience. Code Orange uses similar effects on Underneath alongside blasts of silence and harsh noise walls to throw the listener completely off balance within the context of what would otherwise be a twisted but generally straightforward series of badass riffs and breakdowns, with the occasional butt rock song thrown in for good measure. Between this and Loath's last album, I'm really enjoying the directions that a lot of these newer metalcore bands are going in. I think the genre is due for a second wind, or I guess at this point it would be a third wind. I generally like how goofy and unserious Igor's music is. I mean, where else are you gonna find breakcore mashed with Baroque music and death metal? But sometimes it gets a little too self-indulgent for me. I would gladly remove tracks like Nervous Waltz or Musette Maximum in favor of more stuff like R.a.p. or Himalaya Massive Ritual. Those songs rip. Song for Our Daughter is Laura Marling's best album since what I still consider her masterpiece, Once I Was an Eagle. It's not quite so outside the box, but it's just so well written and performed and intimate that I barely noticed. She can really do no wrong. I don't even have a lot to say here, just go listen to this. Am I the only trans person who can't seem to get into black dresses? It's not that I don't appreciate the topics they tackle within their music or the ways they go about addressing them lyrically or even musically. In a way, I think their artistic decisions make perfect sense for music that's about trans issues and trauma, among other things. I have to respect the fact that they choose to surround these subjects with music that's extremely chaotic, abrasive, and dense. But for me, Peaceful as Hell is just a bridge too far. The chaos, abrasiveness, and density leads to music that, for me, feels cluttered and unfocused. I also just don't really see the appeal of their vocal delivery. I don't doubt it's an authentic expression of their lyrical content, but it just doesn't sit well with me. It's raw to the point of being almost too raw. And now I'm just sort of sitting here wondering why I don't have the same problem with the vocals of, like, the Blood Brothers or the Number 12 Looks Like You. Having a hard time really articulating why this isn't clicking with me. I might need to listen to it again. I mean, there's a lot I should find appealing, but right now it's just not hitting right. It's just for some reason I can't figure it out. Shout out to Black Dresses though. I mean, support trans artists. We say it on the show all the time. Usually when I'm gathering my thoughts on an album, I need to wait for the second or third time around to really sink my teeth into lyrical content. Not so with Fiona Apple. She has a real knack for demanding my attention in that regard, especially here on Fetch the Bolt Cutters, where she speaks very frankly and honestly about her experiences with trauma and abuse, and the way she finds comfort and solidarity with victims of those same things. Thankfully, she's also an excellent songwriter alongside her lyrical talents. There's so many little compositional quirks in every song on this album that keep it steadily rolling along and ensure that it doesn't sit in one place for too long. Shifts between simple and compound meters, odd phrase lengths, very basic chord progressions right alongside more complicated ones. She really knows how to keep me on my toes. And I'm a big fan of the use of found percussion instruments across these songs as well. There's a lot of unique timbres to be found just in the drum and percussion parts. I would advise you not to read the Rate Your Music shoutbox for this album, as it's full of mostly vaguely sexist but sometimes pointedly sexist backlash to Apple and the high praise Fetch the Bolt Cutters has been getting from most corners of the internet and the music press, but the mods got rid of it, so you can't read it anymore. Frankly, good riddance. I was kind of surprised that I liked The Weeknd's After Hours as much as I did. It's probably my favorite Weeknd album at this point, even including the trilogy. I'm just really a sucker for that future garage, synth-heavy 2 a.m. vibe, I guess. Those first 3 songs in particular are just chef's kiss level good. RINA Sawayama's debut album contains what will probably wind up being some of the top pop bangers of the year, including Excess, Comme des Garçons Like the Boys, and Akasaka Sad. The production from Clarence Clarity is solid across the board, although I wish he had a hand in Chosen Family, because as it stands, that song sticks out like a sore thumb. I get that the lyrical message is sweet and all that, but I mean, come on, the 4 chords in 2020, I sleep. Maybe Clarence could have brought a new element out of the song to make up for it, but in its current state, it just sort of sounds like a stock American Idol ballad. Oh well. Album is still pretty good regardless. I'm generally a fan of the more melodic direction that Ulcerate has opted for on their last 2 albums, including this new one, Stare Into Death and Be Still. I do kind of miss the dissonance and the sheer aggression from Everything Is Fire and from Vermis, but either way, these guys have been one of the most creative death metal bands around for over a decade strong, and Stare Into Death and Be Still is just yet another welcome entry into their very consistent streak of quality albums. Also, shout out to the new albums from Black Curse and from Elder. I'm still processing them, but I'm liking them both quite a bit. So that should mostly put us back on schedule. As I said, definitely left some stuff out, but as I also said, it's all over on RYM. Put the links below as always. Really looking forward to this month. I'm actually really looking forward specifically to May 15th. Charlie, Moses, and Perfume Genius, all in the same day. It is my personal hope that the gays will be winning big in about 2 weeks. So, till next time.